Chapter 38:13. Do you miss me? While Suemo was still managing the Annie at home, she still called Yi Mu Bai. Yi Mu Bai picked up the phone. He seemed to be in a public place, so he said calmly to wait for a while. After about a minute, he became quiet. Yi Mu Bai leaned against the aisle, holding the phone in his hand. He looked warm. Why did you call? Do you miss me? Wen Yuan was silent for a while before saying, Can you not let Suemo get involved in our family matters? Yi Mu Bai held a cigarette between his slender fingers. He didn't smoke it, but just played with it between his fingers. After a while, he smiled. Are you unhappy? I like the quiet. She sounded a little unhappy. Besides, Annie is not her artist. Your assistant doesn't need to report to me every day. Yi Mu Bai smiled. Are you unhappy because she is a young and unmarried girl? I'm not. Wen Yuan tried to reason with him. Yi Mu Bai, that's where I live. I don't want anyone else. You just care about other women appearing, don't you? He said lazily. Wen Yuan's eyes widened, and he suddenly asked, You did it on purpose, didn't you? Yi Mu Bai smiled and didn't deny it. Wen Yuan was furious and hung up the phone. Yi Mu Bai looked at the phone, smiled again, and called her. Wen Yuan didn't pick up, so he continued to call until she picked up. Yi Mulin, what's up? She asked in a reserved manner. Yi Mu Bai smiled. I'll be back tonight. Whatever, she said in a bad tone, and then hung up the phone again. Yi Mu Bai looked at the phone, thinking that she was really angry. He thought for a while and called Suemo. You don't have to go to the apartment tomorrow. Suemo breathed a sigh of relief in New York. Thank you, Director Yi. I really can't do this job anymore. Yi Mu Bai smiled. Is Wen Yuan not easy to get along with? Suemo complained. He's easy to get along with, but it makes me feel uneasy when he's too easy to get along with. As a result, he complained to the boss. Yi Mu Bai said lightly, No woman would like another woman to appear at home. Suemo gnashed his teeth. Then why did Night Guide send me? Yi Mu Bai smiled. I'm not going anymore, am I? Then I shall thank you. One night, one director. Suemo gnashed his teeth in anger. This was the first time he had hung up on his boss's call. What the fuck? This seemingly decent man actually had such a bad taste. In New York, when Yuan hung up the phone, the Annie at home looked at him eagerly. Did Sir agree? Wen Yuan also looked at her. After a long time, he slowly said, I think he agreed. The auntie clapped her hands. Like I said, this is not a company, and we are not actors. Sir, you are too ridiculous. As she spoke, she looked at Wen Yuan cautiously. Madam, I didn't mean it that way. I was just spouting nonsense. She was worried that Wen Yuan would be angry, so she kept apologizing. Wen Yuan didn't really care. I'll bring it up when he comes back. Don't worry, Annie. If you don't feel comfortable, I won't feel comfortable either. As she walked, she said, I am Yi Mu Bai's wife, not his artist. Why do I need a manager? The Annie said yes repeatedly. Wen Yuan walked back to the bedroom and frowned slightly. Then he let out a long sigh. She thought that her marriage with Yi Mu Bai was dull, but he obviously didn't think so. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:14. At night, the Annie also went back. She and Xiangnan watched TV together. It was originally a children's program, but then Xiangnan took the remote control and said he wanted to see his father, so Wen Yuan looked at him. Xiangnan smiled and quickly changed the channel to a certain award ceremony. He timed it very well, and it happened to be when Yi Mu Bai went on stage to receive an award. The person who was with him was none other than Lin Danny. Wen Yuan pursed his lips and stared at the person on the screen without blinking. After Yi Mu Bai received the award, he stood side by side with Lin Danny for a photo. There was quite a distance between them. Wen Yuan watched quietly, watching him give his acceptance speech. On the screen, Yi Mu Bai was wearing a classic black suit with a white shirt inside, looking very elegant. He was born to a good family and looked good. Even when he stood in front of many Western men, he was still dazzling. Yi Mu Bai stood in front of the microphone and spoke in English in a soft but firm voice. Thank you to the jury for giving me this award. Here, I would like to thank everyone in the crew for their efforts, thank the audience, and also thank my wife. And he looked at the camera and showed an extremely charming smile. This was also the first time Yi Mu Bai showed such a charming smile in front of the camera since he retired from acting. It was for his wife, and beside him was Lynn Danny, who had been rumored to be in a relationship with him. The live broadcast immediately gave her a specific shot, and the fans off-screen also felt extremely sorry for their idol. Even though Lynn Danny's acting was good, at this moment, it was extremely unnatural. She smiled very reluctantly and then glanced at Yimu Bai, but Yimu Bai didn't return her gaze. After Yimu Bai finished speaking, it was Lynn Danny's turn. Compared to Yimu Bai, she was a little incoherent and was still affected. In the end, she didn't even know what she was saying. Don't get off the stage. She was also sitting with Yimu Bai. After sitting down, she looked at the camera and whispered, "You did it on purpose, didn't you? Did you do it for me to see?" "No, it's for when you on." Yimu Bai was still smiling. She must be watching in front of the TV. Lynn Danny tilted her head and looked at him, her eyes filled with disbelief. After a long time, she said softly, "You won't like her." Yimu Bai tilted his head and smiled faintly. "I like it." Lynn Danny's expression froze. The camera caught it and zoomed in. These awards were also very gossipy. Of course, Wen Yuan, who was sitting in front of the TV, saw it too. Xiangnan looked at her worriedly and gently held her hand with his small hand. "Mom." Wen Yuan knew that he had scared him. He reached out to turn off the TV and smiled. "What's wrong, Xiangnan?" Xiangnan carefully looked at her expression and then said carefully, "Mom, aren't you angry? There's nothing to be angry about. Dad didn't do anything." Wen Yuan reached out to touch his head and whispered, "Okay, go to sleep." Xiangnan responded with an "oh," and obediently went to brush his teeth and wash his face. Then he obediently lay on his own bed. He looked at his mother tenderly. Wen Yuan sat by the bed and told him a story. After a while, Xiangnan fell asleep, his little face very calm. Wen Yuan placed his palm flat on his little head and looked at him for a long time before returning to the room. She didn't think about him and Lynn Danny in the same frame. He had said before that she didn't mind. This book is from Chapter 38:15. However, the way Lynn Danny looked at him still made him a little uncomfortable. Wen Yuan sat quietly for a while before returning to his room. His phone was on the bedside table. There was a WeChat message from Yimu Bai. "I'll be back in 2 hours." Just these few words. Wen Yuan bit his lip and did not reply to his message. He tossed his phone aside and went to the bathroom. After washing up, he lay back on the bed and looked at the time. It was already 11 o'clock. She wasn't going to wait for him. Wen Yuan lay down and covered his face with his hands, then closed his eyes. He didn't want to think about him, and he didn't want to think about the things between him and Lynn Danny. It was pretty boring. When Yimu Bai returned, it was almost 1 o'clock at night. He gently closed the door and put down his luggage. He first went to see Xiangnan, kissed him, and then went to the master bedroom. Wen Yuan fell asleep, but she left the bedside lamp on. Yimu Bai looked at her quietly at the door. After a while, he slowly took off his tie and coat and put them on the sofa in the bedroom. He kicked off his leather shoes and walked to the bed to sit down. The soft bed sunk in. He held her face with one hand and placed the other on her shoulder to prevent her from escaping. Then, he lowered his head and kissed her when Yuan naturally woke up. He opened his eyes and met his dark eyes. He twisted his head and smiled, deepening the kiss. When Yuan had no choice but to grab his hand and try to break free. But instead, his hand was pinned to the bed, their fingers interlocked, and he kissed her even more deeply. When Yuan struggled for a while more, but he simply softened his body and let him kiss him. His kiss was slow and steady, as if he had a lifetime to do this. When he was satisfied, he still held her fingers and asked softly, "Did you miss me?" When Yuan's body softened from the kiss. He turned his head away and said, "No, liar." He chuckled. "Do you want me to check?" As he said this, he was really going to make a move. She remembered that his fingers were so evil a few days ago. She was so scared that she grabbed his hand and didn't let him touch her. Yimu Bai kissed the corner of her mouth. "Tell me the truth, and I'll let you go." She looked away. "I'm not thinking about it." He was about to hit her again when she hurriedly stopped him. She then said softly, "You were the one who said you would let me go if you told me the truth." He was no longer in a hurry. He simply laid down beside her and gently pulled her into his arms. It was obviously very cold outside, so he should be very cold when he came back from outside. However, after taking off his jacket, his body was very warm. She didn't feel any coldness from his body when she came out of the bed. Yi Mubai lowered his head. His face was very close to hers. His voice was low and husky. In such a late night, it sounded a little seductive. Do you miss me, or are you angry? She just looked at him. He smiled. Are you angry? As he spoke, he hooked his fingers around hers. There's nothing going on between us. We just received an award together. I didn't even attend the celebration party before coming back to accompany you. How can you be unhappy? He nibbled on her nose. You don't even look happy. Wen Yuan, you weren't like this before. Wen Yuan looked at him and smiled faintly. How was I before? You were quite attached to me, and his voice became a little low again. You were very obsessed with my body and wouldn't let go of any opportunity to seduce me. He pressed his forehead against hers, and his voice became a little hoarse. Wen Yuan, is my body not attractive to you now? This book came from. Chapter 38:16. Wen Yuan's face heated up, and she looked away. Yi Mubai, I want to sleep. He chuckled. Are you going to sleep, or are you going to sleep with me? She glared at him. I'm going to sleep. She broke away and crawled under his arms, wearing only a white nightgown. He stared at her. When she crawled over, the nightgown stuck to her body, revealing her slender waist. It was especially beautiful. He felt that he could hold her waist with one hand. His eyes were a little fiery. She was clearly a woman who had given birth to a child. Why was her waist still so slender and soft? There was an indescribable feeling in his heart. He gazed at her and said in a low voice, You're going to sleep like this? You're not going to care about me anymore, okay? As he said that, he lifted the blanket and crawled under it, turning off the lights. Wen Yuan fell into his arms and bit her lip. Yi Mubai, his voice continued to be hoarse. We agreed, okay? She thought he was going to say that he was going to give birth to a child, but he bit the tip of her nose that was dripping with sweat. His voice became even lower. I told you to wait for me. I'm going to sleep by myself, okay? As he spoke, he gently pulled out her pajamas from under the blanket. Wen Yuan was no match for him, and in the end, she could only curl up in his arms. His clothes were neat and tidy, without a shirt, trousers, and belt. She felt a little strange in his arms, and she also felt especially fragile. Why aren't you saying anything? He said a little harshly. Wen Yuan bit her lip and closed her eyes gently. Say what? He chuckled, his large palms moving very slowly. He kissed her every now and then until she couldn't take it anymore and cried out. She called his name, Yi Mubai. He asked gently, still unhurriedly. He hooked his arm under her chin and kissed her from her cheek to her chin. When he was in the mood, he bit her chin so hard that she wanted to cry, but she couldn't. She leaned into his arms and cried out his name. Yi Mubai's voice was a little hoarse. Beg me. She was unwilling and turned her head away. He forced her even more. Beg me to take you, okay? Wen Yuan couldn't take it anymore. She bit his shoulder lightly and said in a soft voice, Yi Mubai, you bastard. He knew that he couldn't tease her anymore. He chuckled and grabbed her hand to his belt. Open it. The light was very dim, and her expression was especially gentle and a little shy. He held her hand and said, You're already a mother, and you're still so shy. She used to be very bold, but when he took the initiative, she wasn't like before. Yi, he said in a low voice. She kept her head down, and he forced her to look up. Then, he carried her on top of his body. All kinds of coercion were infuriating. After a few rounds of indulgence, he carried her to the bathroom. In the warm water of the bathtub, he couldn't help but take her again. After this time, not to mention her, even he was almost done, he washed up and returned to the bed. He was still pressing against her, and his voice was like a spring breeze. Do you think we did it for nothing just now? It's all washed away. Wen Yuan was very tired. She closed her eyes and said, Yi Mubai, I don't have the energy to accompany you anymore. He observed her for a while and realized that she was really exhausted by him. He chuckled and lay beside her. He looked at the ceiling for a while and then turned his head. If you don't wait for me in the future, I'll do this to you again. He was actually a little excited. Wen Yuan's eyes were still closed as if she hadn't heard anything. After about half a minute, she opened her eyes. Her gaze was a little complicated. "You're in love," Yi Mubai laughed. "Your reflexes are really long." He leaned against the headboard. He was wearing a white bathrobe, which showed off his young and sturdy figure. A man like him was successful and famous. Naturally, there were many women who liked him. Wen Yuan used to be attracted to him because of his looks. Of the two Yi brothers, Yi Mulin didn't look any worse than Yi Mubai. However, Yi Mulin gave off a more professional vibe. People would usually be scared off by his cold aura. However, Yi Mubai was different. All the women who saw him had only one thought. He was very good-looking, and they wanted to sleep with him. It was probably because Yi Mulin had Yi Jingang's aura, while Yi Mubai had inherited more of Su Fu's aura. At this moment, he was stroking her hair with one hand and rubbing the headboard with the other. It was obvious that he wanted to have an after-sex cigarette. However, he thought of Wen Yuan and gave up. He continued rubbing her hair and kissed her. One more time, Wen Yuan thought that he was a pervert. She turned her back and ignored him. He smiled and slid down. He hugged her from behind and prepared to sleep. However, his hands are not honest. As he touched her, he said softly, "Why is your waist still so thin? You've already given birth to a child. You like it thicker?" She wanted to sleep. She rubbed her head on the pillow and said gently, "Then I'll get fatter." He hugged her from behind. His fingers gently stroked her hair, and his other hand was still holding her slender waist. He was reluctant to let go. Wen Yuan really wanted to sleep. His breathing was weak. "I don't have the energy to accompany you anymore. If you still wanna, you can either solve it yourself or find someone else." She had just finished speaking when she felt a bite on her shoulder. Wen Yuan cried out in pain. "Are you going to say it or not?" His voice was low. "If you say it again, I'll kill you." Chapter 38:17. Wen Yuan's shoulder was in pain, but after being bitten like this, he sobered up a little. She gently blinked her eyes for a long time before saying, "I'm telling the truth." "No." He moved closer to her, and his face was close to hers. He placed a warm palm on her lower abdomen. "You don't think so, Wen Yuan. You are obviously a big vinegar jar." He looked like he wouldn't let her go if she didn't admit it or take back her words. He bit the back of her ear and said, "Say what you just said again. I want to sleep." Wen Yuan turned around in his arms and hugged his body. He stared blankly for a moment, then chuckled softly. He placed her hand on his waist and lowered his head to kiss her. "Say something nice, and I'll let you go." "HM?" Wen Yuan couldn't take it anymore. He bit his lips and buried his face in his chest. She didn't speak, but she was very soft. Yi Mubai lowered his head and kissed her hair. "All right, I'll let you go." She uttered a muffled sound and fell asleep in his arms. She was indeed very tired. Yi Mubai was a normal man. He hadn't had a woman for a long time, and they were newlyweds. He wanted her to be hot at night, almost to the limit of his endurance. However, he allowed her to fall asleep from exhaustion. At this moment, he was a little tempted. In fact, it was not that he had never had a woman before, and it was not that he had never done it with her. However, he had a strong interest in her now. Yi Mubai lay flat and looked at the woman in his arms. He thought about a set of data that he had seen before. No matter how beautiful a woman was, she wouldn't have much interest after doing it once. He and Wen Yuan actually had more than that, but he still wanted her. He reached out and gently pinched her face. He said softly, "I don't know what kind of aphrodisiac you used." He was not a promiscuous man, but now he wanted to come every night. Of course, he could not. They had to have a child now. Thinking that Wen Yuan was pregnant for 10 months and would probably be a few months away from giving birth, he lay down and sighed softly. The next morning, Wen Yuan woke up and realized that he was lying in his arms. He was stunned for a moment before he slowly raised his eyes. He was awake. His smooth chin was slightly green, and it looked very nice under the sunlight. Wen Yuan quickly closed his eyes and pretended not to wake up. Still pretending? A warm voice sounded beside her ear, and then she was pressed onto the soft bed. He kissed her deeply, and then he felt that it was not enough, so he dragged her up in his arms and kissed her. In the morning light, she sat on his lap, feeling a little helpless as he kissed and rubbed her. Her entire body was sore, and she could only let him hug her. He kissed her for a long time, panting with his chin on her shoulder. When he calmed down, he chuckled. "I'm going to the bathroom." After that, he let go of her and walked straight to the bathroom. Wen Yuan laid down and let out a long sigh. He was really a beast. Yi Mubai's voice rang out in the bathroom. "You can sleep for a while. Annie will come and take Xiangnan." Wen Yuan closed her eyes and listened to the sound of water in the bathroom. After a while, she heard him come out. She thought that he would get up. After all, he had taken a shower, but she didn't expect him to come out with a bath towel around him and then lie on the bed again. Wen Yuan closed her eyes. "Yi Mubai, don't you have anything to do?" Chapter 38:18. Wen Yuan closed his eyes. "Yi Mubai, don't you have anything to do? I want to make love. There's nothing else to do today." He smiled and reached out to caress her belly. "These 2 days are our last chance. Why don't we work harder?" He was joking with her, and Wen Yuan did not take it seriously. She felt that he had purposely made her pregnant last night, and it was almost all in the traditional position of Z. If she still didn't get pregnant, she would think that there was something wrong with them. She didn't say anything. He could tell that she was under a lot of pressure, so he rubbed her head and said, "You'll get pregnant. I have a hunch." Wen Yuan looked at him and smiled faintly. It was a little warm and gentle. Yi Mubai's gaze also fell on her face. After a long time, he gently kissed her. This kiss was a little different from before. Wen Yuan was a little startled. "Are you silly?" He hugged her and leaned against the headboard. Then, he looked at the French window opposite them and the change curtains. Wen Yuan also looked at him. She wasn't sure if he liked this style, and she didn't know if he would be angry that she changed her original style. Yi Mubai lowered his head. "It's pretty." He reached out and patted her head. "You can change it anywhere you want." As he spoke, he seemed to think of something. He took out a card from the drawer on the side and put it in her hand. "This is my secondary card. If you want to buy anything, you can withdraw it or swipe it. The password is Xiangnan's birthday." Wen Yuan wanted to reject, but Yi Mubai's voice rang out faintly. "Wen Yuan, we're husband and wife now. You don't have to be so distant with me. Is there a problem with a man raising a family?" Wen Yuan lowered his head and said nothing. Yi Mubai gently held her in his arms and coughed. "Or, do you think it's better for me to sleep with you for free?" She stared at him with wide eyes. "Sleep with me and pay for my services." He rubbed his chin. "Sounds good." Wen Yuan bit his lip. "Yi Mubai, can you not do this?" All the joking in his eyes disappeared, and he looked at her seriously. Wen Yuan's voice was very soft. "You're not like this. Then what kind of man am I?" He hugged her easily. "Isn't it normal to give your wife money to spend? Also, it's normal for me to have sex with my wife, unless you wanted to spread out. In the past, I could control myself because I didn't have a wife. Now, there's no reason for me to be abstinent, right?" When Yuan looked at him, his voice even lighter and more airy. "I always thought that we should keep some distance. When Yuan, you're the one who thinks this way, but I've never thought this way. There isn't a husband in the world who thinks this way. As a husband and wife, we need to keep our distance. Where did you learn this from? Did you learn it from your marriage with Yi Mulin?" He held her chin and whispered, "You've kissed and hugged him in front of me. Do you feel anything?" Wen Yuan was dumbfounded. Was he going to interrogate her? She stared blankly and shook her head slowly. "No." He chuckled softly. "It's good that you don't. I believe that you don't either." Wen Yuan was still looking at him. After a long time, he asked softly, "Do you mind?" He grunted, his eyes never leaving her. Wen Yuan licked his lips and looked away. "At that time, I thought you were gone." She thought about it, a little sad, and laughed at herself. Wen Yuan. He called her name. "Basically, I'm a very pragmatic man. If I like you, I like you. If I don't like you, I don't like you. I won't lie to you and say that I liked you in the past, but I like you now." She was stunned again. He said, "Like?" She stared straight at him, looking a little silly and stupid. Jiuqian Shenwang. Chapter 38:19. Chapter 38:19. Pregnancy when Yuan woke up again, it was already afternoon. The sun shone on the soft bed. When she woke up, her entire body was sore and limp. It was an indescribable feeling. She opened her eyes and looked around. It was a little dazzling, so she covered her eyes with her hands. Lying down, her body was limp, and she didn't want to move. Then, she buried her face in the pillow again. There was Immerse's scent in the pillow. It was a very unique scent. Wen Yuan buried her face. Suddenly, she remembered what happened last night and this morning. Her face was a little red, so she kept burying her face. At this moment, the door opened and a little person ran in. She threw herself on the bed and pulled the blanket. "Mummy!" The next second, the little fellow was stunned, because Mummy wasn't wearing any clothes. The little fellow stared at her blankly for a long time. Then, she whispered to Yi Mu Bai behind her, "Will Mummy catch a cold if she doesn't wear clothes?" Yi Mu Bai followed behind and immediately covered Wen Yuan with the blanket. Then, he carried the little fellow and placed him on the sofa. He hugged her with the blanket. "Do you remember?" Wen Yuan's face was a little red. "Bring Xiangnan out." Xiangnan was still thinking about the previous question. "Won't Mummy feel cold if she doesn't wear clothes?" Yi Mu Bai looked at his son and said seriously, "Daddy will keep Mummy warm. In the future, you will keep your wife warm too." Xiangnan suddenly felt embarrassed. His little face was red. "Can I keep Ainan warm?" Yi Mu Bai and Wen Yuan were stunned. Then, as the father, he was about to go berserk. He shouted at Yi Xiangnan, "That's your sister." Xiangnan shrugged, feeling that it was quite a pity. After all, he thought that Bai Ainan's little body was quite cute. He had secretly taken a look. She had a big head and a small body. She was super cute. Yi Xiangnan looked at his loving parents and felt that he was a little extra, so he ran out quietly. At this time, Yi Mu Bai pushed aside the quilt and looked at the little girl in his arms. He said in a low voice, "Are you tired?" Wen Yuan let him hug him and rested his chin on his shoulder. After a long time, he finally said, "It hurts a little." Yi Mu Bai was taken aback for a moment before he reached his hand under the blanket. Wen Yuan shrieked, "Yi Mu Bai, what are you doing? Does it hurt?" He lowered his eyes to stare at her face. Under his gaze, Wen Yuan's face turned red. Unable to speak for a long time, she could only bury her face in his chest. His fingertips were gentle as he massaged her. She was in his arms, and they had never experienced such intense affection before, just like every other pair of newlyweds. The only difference was that they already had a very big child. At this moment, it was so hot. After a long time, he asked her with a hoarse voice, "Are you feeling better?" Wen Yuan didn't say anything and just hugged him. He was a mature man who understood women, especially her body. He leaned against her ear and asked in a low voice, "Are you feeling better?" Wen Yuan bit his lip and didn't say anything for a long time. He chuckled and continued to massage her for a while. He only let go when both of them couldn't take it anymore. After coaxing her for a long time, he finally helped her put on a set of home clothes. When he was about to leave, Wen Yuan pulled his hand. "Yi Mu Bai, will we have children?" He turned around and smiled. "We will. Don't worry." In fact, Xiangnan's condition was under control. Even if they couldn't get pregnant this month, they could delay it for another 2 months. There would be no problem at all. Moreover, he had a feeling that she was already pregnant with his child. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:20. Chapter 38:20. Pregnancy this time. He hoped that it would be a girl, like Bai Ainan. Wen Yuan pursed her lips. Yi Mu Bai scratched her face. "I'll heat up the food for you. Come out after you brush your teeth and wash your face." She wasn't used to this. Perhaps it was because she had maintained a cold relationship with him for too long. She looked at him in a daze and said softly, "Yi Mu Bai." He nodded and looked at her. "Actually, you don't have to be so nice to me. Just be the same as before," she said uncomfortably. He smiled and stretched out his hand to gently touch her soft and tender face. However, he did not say anything and directly walked out. Wen Yuan's face was a little hot. She didn't say anything and immediately went to brush her teeth and wash her face. However, her heart was still beating very fast. She thought to herself that it had been so long. How could she be so easily seduced by him again? Wen Yuan went out after brushing her teeth and washing her face. Yi Mu Bai had already prepared the food. It was 4 delicious dishes and 1 soup. She saw that he hadn't touched it, So she looked at him. Xiangnan made it. I haven't eaten yet. He smiled faintly and sat down with her. Auntie, I asked her to go back. Wen Yuan nodded. She felt a little uncomfortable sitting with him. Don't you want to ask me about what happened last night? Yimu Bai's voice was indifferent. Wen Yuan ate very slowly and looked up at him very slowly. Then, she said softly, I suddenly don't want to know. He smiled and reached out to stroke her hair. You become silly but cute. Wen Yuan looked at him and forgot to eat. He rubbed her face again. What are you looking at? Eat more. Wen Yuan didn't know if it was an illusion, but his attitude towards her had changed. However, it wasn't fixed. He was still not very gentle in bed and would sometimes be very rough. However, he took good care of her in daily life. He still had to go on business trips. He would go out for 2 days every 3 to 5 days. His mode of travel was often a helicopter. He flew between all the continents in America. Wen Yuan was slowly getting used to it. He would often come home in the middle of the night, and when she was asleep, he would wake her up badly, and then he would make love to her, sometimes too eager to remove his clothes, sometimes even all night long. Wen Yuan felt that this was like the start of a honeymoon. He no longer mentioned having a child, but she had a premonition that she was pregnant because her waist had been sore recently, her appetite was good, and she was also lazy. That day, he wasn't around. Her period hadn't come for 2 days, so when Yuan went out to buy a pregnancy test kit and tested it in the bathroom, when the 2 red lines slowly appeared, she felt a little complicated. She was pregnant. She gently covered her lips and didn't say anything for a long time. At this time, she really wanted to tell Yimu Bai that she was pregnant. When Wen Yuan called her, she felt a little uneasy. What happened when she was pregnant with Xiangnan had traumatized her. But this time, the call was quickly picked up. It was his gentle voice. What's wrong, Wen Yuan? Yimu Bai, where are you? She said very softly. I'm pregnant. Can you come home? When she said this, she felt a little wronged. Because these days, he had been flying around and spending half of his time outside. He wasn't at home even when she was pregnant. Even when he was at home, he spent most of his time in bed. She had a feeling that he clearly didn't have time, but he deliberately came home to spend the night, just to spend the night. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:21. Pregnancy 5. After Wen Yuan said that, the person on the other side seemed to be stunned for a moment. Then, he said in a very soft voice, Is it true? She didn't know if she was acting coquettishly, but Yimu Bai felt that she was acting coquettishly. His voice became even gentler. I still have something to do. I'll ask Su Mo to accompany you to the hospital first. Xiaonan asked Annie to check on him for a long time, and he's fine. I'll go to the hospital after I'm done. Okay? He had thought it through and made arrangements, but Wen Yuan refused. I'll go to the hospital myself. Good girl, listen to me. I'm not worried about her driving. He coaxed her a little, then looked at the higher-ups in the conference room and gestured for them to continue the meeting. He cleared his throat and spoke to Wen Yuan again. I'll head over after I'm done. I'm in New York now. Wen Yuan hung up. She couldn't describe her feelings. She wasn't someone who would throw a tantrum, and she wasn't someone who needed to be taken care of. But when he took care of her and arranged everything, she felt like something was missing. Was it because he had become arrogant because he was favored? Su Mo arrived very quickly. She was a short girl, but she was quick in her work. She was methodical and did not have any personal feelings. She was like a working machine. In this aspect, she was very similar to one person, Yimulin. Wen Yuan was quite bored sitting in her car because he couldn't find a topic to talk about with this little girl. Su Mo drove very carefully. What a joke. Her boss's pregnant wife was sitting in the car. How could she not be careful? The car drove to an expensive private hospital. Miraculously, there was a Chinese gynecologist. It was very convenient to communicate with them, but the price was not cheap. Wen Yuan did a checkup, and the results showed that she was indeed pregnant. Half an hour later, she was sitting on a bench in the corridor of the hospital. Su Mo was talking to Yimu Bai on the phone. She spoke to him in English. Wen Yuan understood what she was saying, but he was complaining in his heart. Fake foreigner, we are all Chinese. Why are you speaking in English? After talking for about 5 minutes, Su Mo hung up the phone and came over to sit with Wen Yuan. Tilting his head, he said, Director Yi said he'll be here soon. He asked us to wait here for a while. After that, she squeezed out a smile on her face. Mrs. Yi, congratulations. Wen Yuan also forced a smile and picked at his fingernails, feeling quite amazed. She thought that Suemo would not smile. Suemo felt quite uncomfortable. He reached out and scratched his head again. Actually, it was night director who arranged for me to go. I didn't want to go either. I had no choice. I'm getting paid. Then she laughed, and so did Wen Yuan. She had actually been jealous of this indifferent assistant. Thinking about it, she felt that she was very childish. Yimu Bai was even more childish. After the two of them talked for a while, Yimu Bai came over. His footsteps were fast and hurried, but when he saw Wen Yuan, he slowed down and stood 5 meters away from him. Suemo stood up and said, "I'll be taking my leave then." As she passed Yimu Bai, she said in a low voice, "Congratulations." Yimu Bai gave her a gentle look. Suemo thought to herself that he was finally giving her a good look. Director Yi wasn't a man who was easy to get along with. She had read the previous report that said Best Actor Yi was especially gentle. She secretly felt that her boss and he were two different men, or that he had schizophrenia. Now she knew that the reason he was so cold before was because he wasn't happy and didn't have a woman. In a chapter. Chapter 38-22. Pregnancy 6. What Lin Shui, Lin Danny, none of them were what he wanted. Now that he had gotten what he wanted, it was like a man who had been abstinent for a few years had suddenly started eating meat. Suemo left, leaving only Wen Yuan and Yimu Bai in the long corridor. His gaze was on her, and she sat there looking at him. She said softly, "When I called you, I was a little scared. I was afraid that no one would answer, that you would disappear again." His gaze became a little gentle, and then he slowly walked over and hugged her. "No." He gently hugged her shoulders and said in a low voice, "No, Wen Yuan." She lay on his shoulder and finally hugged his waist. There was a faint smell of tobacco on his body, as well as the smell of disinfectant from the office. It smelled good when mixed together. She kept hugging him. Yimu Bai smiled. "What's wrong? Are you unhappy about being pregnant?" She shook her head and then nodded randomly. "I'm happy." She was just a little confused and helpless because of happiness. She hadn't thought about happiness when she married him. She thought that it was just to have a child and cure Xiangnan. He had given her so much, but she was afraid. "Yimu Bai, I'm afraid." She closed her eyes. "I'm afraid that I'm dreaming, and you won't be here when I wake up." Yimu Bai reached out and gently stroked her hair, comforting her. "Pregnant people shouldn't be sentimental." She grunted and still hugged him. Actually, he liked it when she hugged him. She was like a child, different from the usual Wen Yuan. He liked it too, but he was afraid that she would be immersed in such emotions for too long. So he comforted her and brought her downstairs to sit in the black RV. Along the way, he hugged her and comforted her. When they arrived at the apartment, Yimu Bai helped her out of the car and went home together. Xiangnan was very happy to know that he would have a little brother and sister. The originally weak little guy made an exception and rolled on the carpet. Yimu Bai helped Wen Yuan to sit down and poured her a glass of water. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. She smiled comfortably, as if she had finally let go of something that had been weighing on her heart for a long time. So did Yimu Bai. He was a man after all. Although he was sure of his own abilities, he was still very happy that it was related to Xiangnan's life and death. He sat beside her and called Yi Mulin back in the country. He also forgot about the time difference. Yi Mulin was sleeping when his phone rang. It was Mu Bai. He sat up quietly and took his phone out. As soon as he closed the door, he whispered, "What's wrong, Mu Bai?" Yi Mu Bai held the phone and coughed softly. "Wen Yuan is pregnant. Am I awesome? Awesome, right?" Yi Mulin stood at the door of the bedroom with his phone in his hand. He smiled warmly. "That's good. I'll tell Mom and Dad that you shouldn't call them at this late hour." Only then did Yi Mu Bai remember that it was nighttime in the country. He smiled and said, "I actually forgot." The two talked for a while before Yi Mulin hung up the phone. When he returned to the bedroom, his little wife was waiting for him. She was lying on the pillow. Her hair was messy, and only her eyes were exposed. He looked at her fierce expression and couldn't help but smile. He closed the door softly and deliberately locked it. What's wrong? You look very much like. Hubby has a woman outside, don't you? She supported her chin with one hand and murmured, making a phone call in the middle of the night secretly. If it's not a woman, then what is it? Is it a wild man? End of this chapter. Recommend the urban guru, Lao Shi Xinshu. Please remember the domain name of this book. For mobile version, M. Chapter 3823. What nonsense are you talking about? He couldn't help but laugh. He sat over and flipped her over, spanking her a few times. Stop spouting nonsense. When did I like men? Baishuli was pressed down and spanked a few times. Her voice was trembling. You're a leader and you're not at home often. I don't know what your hobbies are either. Secretary Lee won't tell me either. He snorted softly and hit her a few more times. You're getting better at talking, aren't you? Secretary Lee is now in the same boat as you. She's my secretary, but she's more like your secretary, don't you think so? That's not true. She lay down and let him hit her. She would only moan a few times when he hit her fiercely to satisfy a certain man's perverted hobbies. She couldn't be clearer about what kind of person he liked. After messing around for a while, he placed her in his arms and reached out to rub his black hair. He said absent-mindedly, Mubai called and said that when Yuan is pregnant. Baishuli sat in his arms and looked up in surprise when she heard that. She played with his chin with her little hand and said very slowly, Yimu Bai, do you feel very upset in your heart? What do you mean by that? Nonsense. He was speechless. He looked at her and seemed to have thought of something. All right, Mubai seems to be the person you've always liked. She yelped and immediately threw herself into his arms. The person I like now is you. He smiled, reached out to pinch her chin, and bit her lightly. Then, are you willing to have another child with the person you like now? She smiled and bit back. I don't want to have a child, but I want to do something to have a child. Yim Yulin raised his eyebrows and turned over to press her down. You've learned to be bad? She hugged his neck and looked at him seductively. Yes, I've learned to be bad. Does Yim Yulin still like me? We'll know after we try. He kissed her slowly and confirmed again. You really don't want to have a child? She held his face and kissed him. We've been separated for so long before we got together. Yim Yulin, you're getting old and not suitable for having child. Really? He gritted his teeth and said in a sinister voice. Shirley whimpered and obediently lay in his arms, doing whatever she wanted. She bit his shoulder and whispered countless compliments into his ear. At this time, she knew best what he liked to hear. Yimu Bai's phone call made by Shiwili suffer a lot from her husband for the whole night. After that, she was washed clean and put on the bed. Yim Yulin came back from a shower and lay beside her. Looking at her weak appearance, he smiled and reached out to pinch her face. Next time you talk nonsense, I'll do this to you again. Actually, she was all ready. She was waiting for him to sleep. So she closed her eyes and fell asleep with him. It's all because of Xiao Bai. Yim Yulin smiled. Yi, I about to marry. She mumbled and moved her face closer to his neck. Then she sighed softly. Yim Yulin, when are we getting married? We have to have a status. I'm sleeping with him every day. She sounded a little aggrieved. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that way. Please remember the domain name of this book. Come. Wonderful Book House mobile version. Come. Chapter 3824. He patted her, but gently. Didn't you marry before? Are you going to marry again? Cece and Gu Zhe still want to hold a romantic wedding. Yim Yulin, you won't be so stingy, will you? She hugged him and acted coquettishly. Gu Zhe bought a really big diamond ring for her. I heard that he wants to kneel down and propose. Her face was full of longing. Yim Yulin was speechless. He pinched his wife's face and said, By Shiweli, your husband is poor. Oh, then I'd better save some money. She obediently rested her head on his chest, then stupidly said, As long as you're up, it's fine. He nodded and said, By Shiweli, I can't promise that you'll be wasteful every day, but I can promise that you'll be able to have fun every night. His rice worm immediately fell to the ground. What happened to being a serious husband? Of course, she knew that the reason why they couldn't hold a grand wedding was because of his identity. It was already amazing that he could be with her after a divorce. It wasn't good to hold a wedding that would cause a sensation. She didn't really want it from him. Anyway, it was fine as long as it was a small scene. She and Yumulin secretly held a small wedding banquet, which was just a family dinner. And Lin Cece and Gu Zhe's wedding was indeed grand. Because of Hungtong Group's global economic status, almost all the newspapers around the world published the news of their wedding, including New York. In the afternoon, Yi Mubai sat quietly on the sofa reading the newspaper in his luxurious apartment in New York. The sun shone through the curtains and shone on him softly. He stared at the newspaper in his hand and didn't move for a long time. Wen Yuan woke up after an afternoon nap and went outside to drink a glass of water. When he came out, he saw Yi Mubai on the sofa. She wanted to call him, but she saw the newspaper in his hand. It was the news of Lin Cece's marriage. He stared at it and was a bit lost in thought. Her heart ached, and she slowly walked over to pour herself a glass of water. At this moment, Yi Mubai noticed her coming out. He closed the newspaper and said with a faint smile, "You're awake?" He naturally took her into his arms and held the cup for her to drink. Wen Yuan took small sips. After drinking half a cup, he stopped drinking. He put down the cup and reached out to rub her hair. "Are you okay?" She nodded, then looked at him, trying to find something in his face. His gaze was unfathomable as he smiled faintly. "What's wrong?" Wen Yuan broke away from him and sat beside him. His voice was very soft. "You saw her get married?" "So." Yi Mubai gently rubbed her head. "You think too much?" Wen Yuan put his hand on his abdomen and smiled lightly. "Yi Mubai, I know that she will always have a place in your heart." She also knew that in his heart, she was far more important in bed. She would never be able to get close to his soul. Men were like this. What they couldn't get would always be the moonlight. He might like her a little, but it was just a little, nothing more. It wasn't that Wen Yuan didn't feel a little sad. He didn't mean to hurt her, but her heart was still a little hurt. Every woman hoped that their husband only had her in his heart. When she found out that it wasn't, she couldn't help but feel disappointed, even if she already knew it. After Wen Yuan finished speaking, Yi Mubai frowned. "Wen Yuan, that was a long time ago." She looked up at him. "I can understand." Chapter 38-25. Yi Mubai was even more displeased. He glared at her for a few seconds before replying slowly, "You don't need to understand because it won't be a problem between us." Wen Yuan did not say anything. He still coaxed her and pulled her into his embrace, kissing her face. "I heard that pregnant women are very emotional. I didn't believe in the past, but now I do." He kissed her lightly and coaxed her. "It's just in the past, and nothing happened between us." All adults knew what it meant to say that nothing had happened. It meant that they hadn't slept together. Wen Yuan understood. Actually, she knew better that it was because he cherished Lin Cece. With Yi Mubai, there were some things that were not easy to explain. For example, he lusted after Wen Yuan and doted on Lin Cece. Could he say these things to his wife? Of course not. Therefore, he might as well not say it. Some things will be better after a while. Later on, he threw away all the newspapers at home, not letting her see them. He did not read them either, and his heart was at peace. He spent more time at home, but he would also go out to work, but not for too long. He had film companies both in and out of the country. She could tell that he was preparing for his return in the future. She did not ask too much about his work and just stayed at home to take care of the baby. When Wen Yuan was 5 months pregnant, Lin Danny called and said that she was near her house and wanted to meet her. Wen Yuan agreed and let Lin Danny come to the apartment. With the Annie at home, nothing would happen. After not seeing her for half a year, Lin Danny was different from before. She was not as spoiled as before and was more mature. She sat on the sofa and looked at the apartment, smiling. "I just wanted to have a chat with you today." "All right, don't think too much. I'm getting married." She took out an invitation. "There's an uncle's son who has been chasing after me for many years. I recently agreed." Wen Yuan picked it up and looked at the photo. He then smiled. "You two are quite compatible." Lin Danny just smiled and flipped her hair. "It's all right. I didn't know much in the past and always thought that love was greater than the sky. Actually, it's nothing much. It doesn't matter who you spend it with. Only someone who truly loves you." As she spoke, she smiled again. Actually, sometimes if it's too hard, just let it go. There's nothing bad about that. Lin Danny left after chatting for a while. Of course, Wen Yuan wouldn't go to her wedding, and she didn't ask Yi Bai if he would go. When Yi Bai came back in the evening, he saw the invitation on the tea table. After taking a shower, he lay down on the bed. Wen Yuan seemed to be asleep, but he knew that she was not. He asked her softly, "Has Lin Danny been here?" "Yes. You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. Then, after a moment's thought, she added, "Are you going?" Yi Bai reaches out and rubs her hair. After thinking for a while, he says, "I have a lot of cooperation with Lin Danny's father, so I may have to attend. The wedding is in New York. Wen Yuan, come with me, okay?" She lowered her head. "I don't want to go over. You're my wife, and the baby is stable now. Besides, I don't want others to know that I have a wife." He didn't finish his sentence, but she understood. A good-looking, rich man like him, who was involved in the film and television industry, would have many women throwing themselves at him. Wen Yuan was probably because of this, so she agrees. Just this once. Chapter 38:26. Happy to see Lao Qing? 1 inch, why don't you want to accompany me to socialize? When a child is born, accompany me and take it as a distraction, okay? He was still stroking her hair, and his voice was a little hoarse. Wen Yuan looked down. Yi Bai, I don't like that kind of life anymore. I don't like the entertainment industry too much either. I don't want to get close to it. She didn't want to see all the women looking at her husband like that. She was afraid that she would think too much, so she would rather stay away from that circle. Yi Bai looked at her quietly for a while. In the end, he didn't say anything and just helped her lie down. "Okay, let's go to sleep." She laid on her side in his arms. Her stomach was already 4 months old, and it was already a little big. It was as though there was a layer of skin separating them. But after a while, she felt the changes in his body, and his breathing became a little hurried. She rested her face on his shoulder and wanted to move away, but he pressed her head down. His voice was hoarse in the dark. "Don't move." She bit her lip and looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Yi Bai turned his body and buried his face in her neck. His breathing was restrained. After a long time, when she thought he would let her go, he grabbed her hand and whispered, "Wen Yuan, we haven't done it for 4 months. Actually, they could do it, but he was always worried that they were different from other couples. Xiangnan couldn't take the risk. So every time he wanted to do it, he would suppress it. This time, he really couldn't take it anymore. Wen Yuan bit her lip and leaned in his arms, letting him do it. Her ears were filled with his suppressed and hoarse voice, showing his extreme joy. She didn't quite understand. Even if he chose to do it, why didn't he do it himself? Of course, as his wife, she couldn't refuse him. So she let him be. After a long time, he finally had enough and hugged her a little tighter. Wen Yuan lay in his arms and heard his rapid heartbeat. She bit her lip and felt a little helpless. After a while, he whispered in her ear, "Are you uncomfortable?" She shook her head. He smiled gently. "Liar." He was about to hit her when Wen Yuan grabbed his hand and whispered, "I'm fine." He hesitated for a moment, but decided to let her go. Actually, he knew that she was purposely suppressing herself for Xiangnan. She didn't even dare to enjoy herself like this. At that moment, his feelings were a little complicated, and he also lost interest. So in a few months after she was pregnant, they didn't have sex, not even tonight. If he couldn't hold it in anymore, he would go to the bathroom. Sometimes when Wen Yuan saw him like this, he would wonder if he would break down from holding it in too much. Most men wouldn't think about it as often as he did. In fact, their relationship had changed ever since Lin Cece got married, although they didn't say it out loud. On the day of Lin Danny's wedding, Wen Yuan and Yi Bai went together. Because she was pregnant, she had chosen a V-neck, ash-gray dress. The hem of the dress was spread out to cover her slightly bulging belly and accentuate her slender waist. Her long hair was casually tied up, which made her seem more gentle. Her shoes were soft and mid-heeled, and she held a white sheepskin handbag in her hand. She looked especially good, which probably had something to do with Wen Yuan's family background. Even though she didn't socialize much, she was very good at picking out clothes, and she definitely wasn't stingy enough to bring them out. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:27. When she came out of the bedroom, Yi Mu-bai was stunned. Perhaps it was because he hadn't seen her at home for half a year that he wasn't used to it. He stared at her for a long time, but when Yuan misunderstood and said calmly, "Cosmetics are for pregnant women. There won't be a problem." He smiled and held her hand. "I'm just a little surprised when Yuan." As he said that, he leaned forward and kissed her. When Yuan was stunned. He had already held her hand and walked out. Xiangnan wanted to pounce on him, but his parents had already left. Xiangnan said in a daze, "Mummy is so beautiful." Sigh. There was no place for him in the world of the two of them. When Yuan followed, Yi Mu-bai downstairs. He drove a black Phantom, and when Yuan sat in the back seat, Yi Mu-bai sat in the car and said calmly, "There's a cup in front with warm water in it. Drink some when you're thirsty. Don't drink any beverages or alcohol when you go to the reception later. Understand?" His tone was a little domineering, which was rare. When Yuan nodded, "I know." Yi Mu-bai drove on the streets of New York and looked at the rearview mirror from time to time. Then he smiled. "When Yuan, are you going to attend the wedding with his stepmother's face? Think about what the reporters will write. They will probably dig up the things between me and Lin Danny again." When Yuan bit his lips, "That has nothing to do with me. You're my wife. How is that not related?" He chuckled. "Be happy." When Yuan didn't say anything. Of course, she wouldn't put on an expression. However, she didn't want to pretend to be happy on purpose. That would be very fake. As for Yi Mu-bai, he just needed her to be normal. Tonight, a lot of celebrities attended, and it was the first time that Yi Mu-bai had brought his wife to socialize, so there were as many cameras on them as there were couples, especially Yi Mu-bai and Lin Danny. Fortunately, there was no news about Lin Danny's suicide abroad, so they didn't pay much attention to it. However, Wen Yuan's oriental temperament was very charming, so the foreigners kept clicking the shutter, thinking that she was the Oriental Hepburn. Yi Mu-bai took care of her emotions, afraid that she wouldn't be used to it. In fact, how could a girl from the Wen family not be used to it? Besides, she had been Yi Mu-bai's nominal wife for a few years, so she had long been used to these occasions. In the banquet hall, she and Yi Mu-bai gave the gifts together and chatted for a while. Then he helped her sit down on the sofa. From time to time, people would come over to chat with them. Later, Yi Mu-bai needed to talk to a new project. It was not convenient here, so when Yuan politely asked him to talk to someone else, saying that she could do it alone, Yi Mu-bai and a few of the producers went to another corner to chat. When Yuan leaned against the wall and read a magazine for a while, eating some snacks. The atmosphere in the banquet hall was very good. It was said that a world-class violinist had been invited, and it was because both parties had a personal relationship. When Yuan listened and was dazed for a moment. Then she turned her head and saw a familiar face. She slowly stood up and looked at the young man who was playing the violinist. Kong Xiao. She murmured his name. The man in front of her smiled, finished playing a song, and put down the strings in his hand. "Long time no see, Wen Yuan." Kong Xiao reached out to her, and when Yuan hesitantly put her hand in his. She thought it would be a handshake, but Kong Xiao gently pulled her into his arms and kissed her on the cheek. "Are you all right?" He just kissed her face. It was normal abroad. Although when Yuan was a little uncomfortable, she didn't make a fuss. She stood up straight and pursed her lips. "I'm fine. Why are you here?" "I'm just that personal friendship." He smiled. "I can't help it." As he said that, he put down the violinist and took a glass of red wine for her. He also took a glass for himself. "Let's drink to our reunion." When Yuan wanted to refuse, but the glass in her hand was taken by a strong hand. Then, it was Yi Mu-bai's indifferent voice. "Mr. Kong, my wife is pregnant and can't drink. Sorry." Chapter 38:28. When Yuan's body stiffened, and then he slowly looked at Yi Mu-bai. With an inscrutable expression on his face, he naturally put one hand around her waist, looked at Kong Xiao with a smile, and said to Wen Yuan, "Don't you want to introduce him?" Wen Yuan came back to his senses and forced a smile. "My university tutor's son, Kong Xiao, is also a famous violinist." She paused for a moment. "Kong Xiao, my husband Yi Mu-bai." Kong Xiao's eyes fell on her face, and after a while, he said, I heard from my mother that you are married. With that, he reached out to Yi Mubai. Mr. Yi, I've heard about you for a long time. Yi Mubai also reached out to shake his hand. Mr. Kong, I've heard about you and your mother from Wen Yuan. Kong Xiao smiled and looked at Wen Yuan. Really? Wen Yuan was a little uncomfortable. When did she mention it to Yi Mubai? He was just talking nonsense. But Yi Mubai was very relaxed. He held the glass of red wine and clinked it with Kong Xiao. Mr. Kong, are you in New York recently? Kong Xiao's eyes fell on Wen Yuan's face. Just for a week, and then I'll go to Europe. He still had something to do, so he didn't chat with them for too long. Wen Yuan, contact me when you return to China. My mother misses you very much. Wen Yuan nodded. I will. Kong Xiao's eyes fell on her face and then moved to her lower abdomen. Finally, he said hoarsely, I haven't congratulated you yet. It was probably because the regret in his eyes was too obvious, and the way he looked at her was not like a senior brother looking at a junior sister, but purely like a man looking at a woman. Wen Yuan couldn't ignore it, and of course, Yi Mubai could see it even more clearly. This man had such thoughts about his wife. Wen Yuan also felt uncomfortable. He reached out and touched his hair. Thank you. Their eyes met and stared at each other for a few seconds. Kong Xiao left, and after a while, Alice was played. Wen Yuan looked up and met Yi Mubai's gaze. There was a hint of contemplation in his eyes. He drank the red wine in his glass and asked casually, Were you on good terms with him before? Wen Yuan was still a little uncomfortable. He pursed his lips and said, Because of his mother, I'm asking about your relationship. Wen Yuan, have you ever liked him? Yi Mubai asked very straightforwardly. He didn't care about the occasion. He just looked around and asked directly. There was a reason why he asked this question. Kong Xiao was handsome and famous all over the world. He must have attracted a lot of girls when he was young. Wen Yuan seemed like this type of guy. He, Yi Mubai, reeked of money. Would she still like him? Wen Yuan frowned at his direct question, but still answered, no. Then did he like you? He asked immediately. This time, Wen Yuan didn't answer him immediately. He sat down and ate for a while before saying, no. Liar. He looked at her condescendingly. His eyes were a little deep. Wen Yuan looked up and met his unfathomable eyes. For a long time, they didn't speak, and the atmosphere was very subtle. There was a slap, and there was Konkola's Alice. Yi Mubai suddenly leaned forward and whispered in her ear, Kong Xiao played it for you to hear, didn't he? She wanted to deny it, but Yi Mubai's finger gently touched her lips. I don't believe you haven't heard it. Chapter 38-29. The scene of Kong Ji looking at his wife lovingly while Wen Yuan was playing the piano appeared in his mind. Just thinking about it made him feel uncomfortable. Wen Yuan frowned again. Yi Mubai, you really think too much. You know very well whether I think too much or not. Okay? He pressed his finger on her lips, hinting at her. Later, he went to socialize again, but as soon as Wen Yuan looked up, she could see him looking at her thoughtfully, as if he was catching her in the act. Wen Yuan felt a little annoyed. Later, Kong Xiao didn't come to talk to her again, probably because he noticed something. It wasn't until the wedding buffet was over and Wen Yuan and Yi Mubai left that Kong Xiao came over and handed her a business card. Call me if you need anything in the future. Wen Yuan nodded. Okay, senior brother. I will. Kong Xiao's eyes were still on her face. After a while, he smiled. Okay, let's go back. It's getting late. However, his own gaze was still on her face. As a man, Yi Mubai could see the strong reluctance in his heart. His heart was sour as he held onto Wen Yuan's waist and smiled. Wen Yuan, we should go. You're pregnant. You should rest more. Wen Yuan knew that he did it on purpose, but he had no choice but to smile at Kong Xiao and leave with him. Yi Mubai drank. The driver drove the car, and he sat in the back seat with Wen Yuan. Sitting in the back seat, Kong Xiao's voice was very light. Did you have a good time tonight? Wen Yuan was a little tired. He leaned against the seat, squinted his eyes, and said in a lazy voice, What do you mean? Yi Mubai leaned over, and his nose was filled with a faint smell of alcohol. The mellow fragrance mixed with the man's breath was very tempting. He stared at her face and didn't say anything. He just reached out and rubbed her earlobe. You should take a rest first. Wen Yuan thought that the matter was over. She was really tired, so she closed her eyes slightly. She didn't wake up until the car stopped in front of the apartment. The driver was already gone, and there were only the two of them. She yawned. "We're here." Just as she was about to get out of the car, Yimu Bai helped her put on his jacket and said softly, "You look distracted." Strangely, she found a trace of jealousy in his words. She asked softly, "Yimu Bai, are you jealous?" "No." He held her with one arm and took her bag with the other, leading her into the elevator. She still wanted to say something, but he had already leaned over and kissed her hard and hurried, hurting her lips. "Yimu Bai." Her voice was intermittent. She clenched her fists and tried to push him away, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move him away. He kept trapping her, not letting her move an inch. His kiss was also completely invading her. His breath touched her, and with every breath they took, it seeped into her limbs. She had no strength to resist, and her legs were so weak that her body slid down. Yimu Bai held her waist with one hand and kissed her even more deeply. Wen Yuan didn't know what was wrong with him, but she vaguely felt that it had something to do with Kong Xiao. She tried to explain, but her voice was muffled. He stopped and stared at her with a burning gaze. Then, he kissed her again under her gaze. Wen Yuan was helpless and could only let him kiss her. She wanted to say that their elevator had been stopped for a long time, and it was opening and closing. At this time, their Annie came out. She stood at the door and saw them kissing in the elevator. The Annie was stunned for a moment and wanted to avoid it, but Yimu Bai noticed her presence. Chapter 38:30. They had stopped kissing, but the atmosphere was quite subtle. The auntie cleared her throat uncomfortably. "I'm going to take out the trash." Yimu Bai nodded and walked out of the elevator with Wen Yuan. The elderly Annie almost jumped into the elevator. "Oh yeah, I'll go back later. I won't be coming back." As for the trash can, she would take it home. The elevator door closed. Wen Yuan flicked her hair and lowered her head, not saying a word. Yimu Bai swiped the door and turned sideways. "Let's go home." She looked up at him and felt that his gaze was a bit unfathomable. He followed her in as soon as she entered, and then he caught her hand. She called his name. "Yimu Bai." He carried her and walked towards the master bedroom. Wen Yuan was nervous. She had a vague premonition of what he wanted to do. Her fingers tugged at the clothes on his shoulders. "I'm pregnant." He didn't hear it. There was a touch of indifference on his handsome face. She hadn't seen him like this for a long time. She was a little afraid that he would hurt the child. This wasn't just a child, but also Xiangnan's life. She felt that no matter how irrational he was, he shouldn't joke about Xiangnan. So when he put her on the soft bed, she felt uneasy. "There's nothing between me and Kong Xiao. Don't think too much." He bent his knees on both sides of her and touched her red lips with his fingers. He smiled. "I didn't mention him. Why do you look like you're guilty?" "I didn't." She turned her face away because his gaze was too aggressive. She didn't want to talk to him anymore. At this time, he didn't want to talk to her either. He just wanted to have her and prove that she was his. She was pregnant. No matter how rough he was, he still retained a bit of gentleness. However, the whole process was really not something a pregnant woman could bear. Moreover, they hadn't done it for a few months. When Yuan couldn't take it anymore. Later, he only let her go after she cried so hard. However, it was already very late at night. Yimu Bai let out a sigh of relief. After being fierce, his body felt comfortable, but he also felt a little regretful. When Yuan was quite miserable, she lay there for a long time without moving, just lightly panting. Yimu Bai kissed her eyebrows and asked in a low voice, "Are you okay?" Another tear slid down the corner of Wen Yuan's eye. She didn't want to talk to him. Yimu Bai also knew that he was a bit harsh just now. His voice was slightly hoarse. "All right, I'm not angry anymore. Did I make you uncomfortable? Yimu Bai, you bastard." She was so angry that she slowly turned her back to him. He laughed lowly and hugged her from behind. "Are you angry?" He knew that she had feelings for him, but tonight he was mainly relying on his feelings. It was impossible for her to enjoy it. She probably hated him to the core, right? Hugging her, His fingers slowly moved down to gently rub her stomach. Then he asked in a low and hoarse voice, "Tell me, did he confess to you?" Wen Yuan knew who he was talking about. She was silent for a moment. "No, really. I believe you," he said generously. Then he murmured, "But he likes you." Wen Yuan, "I don't believe that you can't sense it." As he spoke, he gently bit her earlobe. He was a little unwilling, but there was also an indescribable feeling in his heart. Wen Yuan didn't answer his question. He was right. She could feel it. She knew it when she was young. However, at that time, Kong Xiao wanted to go abroad. He never said anything, so she pretended not to know. Later on, she was infatuated with Yi Mu Bai. Kong Xiao seemed to have disappeared from her life. However, at this moment, when she thought back to the past, it was actually very beautiful. Chapter 38-31. She didn't say anything, which aroused his dissatisfaction. He bit her again. "What are you thinking about?" Wen Yuan's fingers gently stroked the pillow. She suddenly had a wicked idea. She smiled. "I was thinking that if Kong Xiao had told me at that time, and I had promised him, would it have been—" As soon as she finished speaking, her body was pulled over by him. He pinned her on the pillow. It was a little overbearing, but he didn't forget to be gentle to her. He carefully avoided her stomach. Wen Yuan, his expression was a little scary, which she had never seen before. For a moment, she looked at him and didn't say anything for a long time. He continued, "You're not allowed to see him in the future." She closed her eyes. "He's my teacher's son. Yi Mu Bai, don't think too much about it. I won't go on my way to meet him, but I won't avoid him either. That would be too problematic." Yi Mu Bai looked at her quietly. He originally wanted to force her, but when he saw Wen Yuan like this, he gave up. She had never been a weak woman, as he had thought. She was resolute and crafty, and his attraction had come too suddenly. He turned to the side and lay quietly for a while. Then he said, "I'll take you to the shower." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. He carried her to the shower and carried her back to the bed in the bedroom to help her wipe. His breathing became chaotic again. After all, he was a man who hadn't had sex for several months. Wen Yuan's eyes opened a slit and looked at him. Then he said in a low voice, "Just now, you wanted enough. Now, even if you want more, I don't have the strength to accompany you." She almost sighed and said, "Yi Mu Bai, I want to sleep for a while." Yi Mu Bai looked at her condescendingly. He put down his hand that was originally on her shoulder, which meant that he was letting her go. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "You sleep." Wen Yuan fell asleep quickly, but he didn't feel sleepy. He went outside to smoke a cigarette. He wanted to see Xiangnan, but his eyes bumped into her bag. He went over to sit on the sofa and took out a business card from her bag. It was given to her by Kong Xiao. Yi Mu Bai stared at it for a long time. Finally, he took a lighter and burned it. Flirting in front of him, after the fever was over, he felt refreshed and went back to his room to sleep. Wen Yuan had slept with him fiercely at night, and she was pregnant for several months, so she woke up late. When she woke up, it was already past 10 o'clock. She opened her eyes and sat up. She heard Xiangnan and Yi Mu Bai talking outside. "He's still at home?" Wen Yuan lowered her face and placed her hand on her abdomen. Her abdomen moved slightly. She could feel the child moving. Perhaps he was a little impatient after being tormented by his father last night. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. Thinking back to last night, he seemed to be so angry that he acted like this. Or maybe he couldn't hold it in anymore. Wen Yuan got up to brush her teeth and wash her face before going out. Yi Mu Bai was reading a book with Xiangnan in his arms. When he saw her coming out, he put Xiangnan down and naturally prepared breakfast for her. Wen Yuan sat down and ate breakfast in silence. Yi Mu Bai stared at her. Finally, she couldn't stand his gaze and looked up. "Why are you looking at me like that?" He coughed softly. "Are you okay now?" Wen Yuan's face heated up. She then said in a low voice, "You didn't ask last night. Don't you think it's too late to ask now?" He said in a low voice, "Then I'll ask you the next time I do it, Tomorrow, which is Friday, will be updated at noon. 15 chapters. This is not the most explosive chapter. The most explosive chapter is yet to come. Chapter 38-32. Wen Yuan ignored him and continued to eat his breakfast. In the afternoon, Yi Mubai went to the company in New York. Wen Yuan went to look through Kong Xiao's business card. She and Kong Xiao used to have a good relationship. She wanted to save his phone number, but she couldn't find it in her bag. She was a little puzzled. She had clearly put it in her bag. Later, she saw Mubai's cigarettes and a lighter on the coffee table. She took a look at the trash can, and there were obvious ashes in it. She was furious. He didn't even cover up what he did. Wen Yuan was a little angry. He stared at it for a long time, but didn't say anything in the end. Yi Mubai came home very late. When he got home, Wen Yuan and Xiangnan were already asleep. He entered the bedroom quietly and went straight to the bathroom without turning on the light. When he came back and lay on the bed, he reached out and touched Wen Yuan. "Are you asleep?" She didn't move. He smiled. "I know you're not asleep." Wen Yuan was angry with him, but didn't say anything. He didn't care if he could ignore him. He leaned against the headboard and pinched her face. "I know you're not asleep. Are you angry?" Wen Yuan couldn't help but slap his hand away. "Yi Mubai, you know why I'm angry. Because I burned Kong Xiao's business card?" he said coldly and indifferently. Wen Yuan was furious. "Yi Mubai, in your heart, I'm just an accessory, a tool for you to give birth to a child, am I right?" He retracted his fingers that were stroking her hair and said indifferently, "Do you think I'll be willing to let you hang out with someone who admires you?" Wen Yuan sat down. Sensing that he was about to lie down and sleep, she pursed her lips and said in a soft voice, "You and Lin Danny are far more than just love. Didn't you go to her wedding and the award ceremony as well? Did I say anything?" Liu Yanchen was speechless. "You and Lin Danny are way more than just love." Yi Mubai opened his eyes. "Wen Yuan, are you going to bring up the past with me?" "No, I just want to say that we are equal. I don't want my normal contact to be restricted by you," Wen Yuan said calmly. After saying that, he sat up again and frowned. "Lin Danny and I are needed for work. Kong Xiao, is it? Is it necessary to keep in touch?" Wen Yuan raised her head and stared at him. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't understand. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "Yi Mubai, I realize that I can't talk to you clearly. He likes you." That was what he minded. Wen Yuan chuckled. "Lin Danny doesn't like you? You've even hugged and kissed. Yi Mubai, you're a double standard now." He turned on a light, stared at her, and said word by word, "You don't want to see Kong Xiao. I don't want to see Lin Danny either. These are two different things." Wen Yuan felt a little tired and looked down. "Yi Mubai, you're still not getting to the point. There's nothing going on between me and Kong Xiao. We're just old friends. Why can't we keep in touch?" His breath caught his throat, and he asked her softly, "Do you want to be in contact with him?" Wen Yuan stared at his expression and said very slowly, "I can't talk to you." She didn't want to argue with him, so she lifted the covers and got up. "I'll sleep in the guest room." Just as he stood up, his wrist was caught by a hand. "You sleep here. I'll sleep in the guest room," he whispered and brought her back. However, he didn't put her under the covers, but held her in his arms. Chapter 38-33. Wen Yuan struggled. "Yi Mubai, what are you doing?" He wasn't cold when he hugged her, but they were in a cold war. "What is he doing now?" Yi Mubai hugged her and placed her in his arms. He lowered his head and whispered in her ear, "I'm jealous." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. She just leaned in his arms and bit his shoulder gently. She had an indescribable grievance in her heart, but she couldn't say it out loud. From the start to the end, she only liked him, and she knew that there were countless women by his side in the past. But now, because of Kong Xiao's business card, they had fallen out like this. She was a little sad. The unfairness between them could only mean one thing. He didn't see her as an equal. He said that he was jealous. Wasn't she angry? Wen Yuan didn't say anything. After he kissed her, he didn't go to the guest room and hug her to sleep. The matter with Kong Xiao was left unsettled. After all, life still had to go on. But then, Wen Yuan bumped into Kong Xiao in the hospital. He came to the hospital to visit someone he knew as a farewell. Wen Yuan happened to bump into him during her prenatal checkup. Moreover, Yi Mubai had something to do today, so Su Imo accompanied her. Kong Xiao was surprised to bump into him on the stairs. Then she smiled lightly. We meet again. Wen Yuan smiled too. What a coincidence. Suemo looked at them and pointed to the front. You guys chat. I'll talk to the doctor first. Wen Yuan nodded. After Suemo walked far away, she sat on the bench with Kong Xiao. You're leaving New York? He nodded. Yes, I'm leaving. Didn't Sir accompany you to the prenatal checkup? Wen Yuan was stunned. Oh, he had something to do today. Then there was silence. Wen Yuan then found a topic. How is teacher? He had a heart operation the year before last. He's doing well now. Kong Xiao sighed. So I'll probably come back to develop my career in the next 2 years. My mother needs someone to take care of her. Wen Yuan nodded. Yes. Kong Xiao hesitated for a moment. Does he treat you well? Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment before he smiled. Not bad. Kong Xiao stared at her eyes. There was a faint flame, but he restrained himself, not revealing it. Nor would he give her pressure. After all, she was already a wife. Kong Xiao coughed lightly. All right, let's have a meal later. Wen Yuan couldn't refuse because Kong Xiao's mother treated her very, very well. She often practiced the piano at the Kong residence and was very familiar with Kong Xiao. She thought that if it weren't for the fact that she was infatuated with Yimu Bai, the person she would eventually marry would most likely be Kong Xiao. She looked down. All right, your phone, he suddenly said. Wen Yuan looked at him in surprise. He smiled again. My phone. I'll save my number. She was a little touched that he didn't expose her. She gave him the phone, and he dialed his number to save it for her. When he put away the phone, he asked in a low voice, It won't be hard for you to have dinner with me, right? He was afraid that Yimu Bai would make things difficult for her. In Kong Xiao's heart, he liked Wen Yuan, but he could only give his blessings for her marriage. He could only hide everything else in his heart. Wen Yuan shook his head. No. She smiled at him. I'm not such a useless person. Kong Xiao's eyes were stained with some pain. He didn't know what to say. Chapter 38-34. She was right. She was not a useless girl. She had her principles. He had always thought that when she grew up and became famous, she would be waiting for him there. But when he turned around, she fell in love with someone else. At that time, when he returned to China, they sat under a tree and drank beer. She told him that she had never seen a man as handsome as Yimu Bai and that she wanted to pursue him. At that time, he felt bitter. He wanted to tell her that he liked her, but he saw the little stars in her eyes. It was a Wen Yuan that he had never seen before. For love, regardless of anything. Later on, she married Yi Mulin. When they met again, her wish came true. She stood beside Yimu Bai and became Mrs. Yi. Wen Yuan had never been someone who could be bullied easily. She was just good at enduring silently. She was a young lady with a contradictory personality, but he liked this kind of personality. Kong Xiao smiled and couldn't help putting his hand in the air. It seemed that he wanted to stroke her hair or touch her face, but his hand stayed in the air for a long time. Finally, his voice was a little hoarse. I'll go to the restaurant opposite first. Come back after the checkup. I'll wait for you. Wen Yuan nodded. At the other end of the aisle, Suemo held her breath. In fact, she could see that Kong Xiao liked Wen Yuan very much. His eyes were very gentle. She had a feeling that Wen Yuan would be happier with Kong Xiao than with her boss. But she couldn't help it. Suemo thought to herself that she would never tell her boss what happened today. But it didn't mean that Yimu Bai didn't know. Suemo accompanied Wen Yuan to the checkup. The baby was all right. Wen Yuan looked at Suemo and it didn't hide it. I asked Kong Xiao to have dinner together. Come with us. Of course, Suemo refused. You guys go ahead. I'll eat alone. I'll wait for you in the car. Then she blinked. I won't tell Director Yi. Don't worry. Wen Yuan smiled. He's just an old friend. Suemo also smiled. But in her heart, she thought, but Director Yi will be angry and jealous. Don't think that I can't see it. The atmosphere was subtle. Suemo waved her hand and ran away. After a while, she came back. I'll send you there. Mr. Kong, please send it back. She was always worried. As the special assistant, she felt that this baby was particularly important to the night couple. Wen Yuan didn't refuse. He let Su Mo accompany him to the restaurant that Kong Xiao had booked. The place was pretty good. Kong Xiao also invited Su Mo to eat together, but Su Mo refused. After Su Mo left, Kong Xiao smiled. This little assistant is quite interesting. Wen Yuan flipped his hair and looked at him. Do you want me to introduce her to you? She's quite nice. She's 28 years old and suits you well. After she finished speaking, Kong Xiao remained silent for a long time. After a long while, Kong Xiao poured her a cup of warm water. Then he said in a low voice, "Why did you change your career to be a matchmaker? Do I look like I'm lacking a girlfriend?" Wen Yuan was a little embarrassed. He smiled faintly and said, "That's true, you don't lack girlfriends." While Kong Xiao was ordering, he didn't ask her what she liked to eat, because he clearly knew what she liked to eat. While ordering, he looked up and smiled at her. "But I don't have a girlfriend right now." Wen Yuan was a little speechless. "Kong Xiao, you're having a bad taste now." Chapter 38-35. Crazy Jealous 8. He closed the menu and handed it to the waiter. "I'm just not interested in the girl just now. Is it wrong to refuse?" Wen Yuan drank some water and held a glass. "But my teacher will want you to get married soon." He was 2 years older than her and was now 35 years old. It was indeed the age to get married. Kong Xiao looked at her and said softly, "Wen Yuan, my mother will want me to find a girl I really like. Otherwise, marriage is just a formality. What's the point of it?" Wen Yuan drank some water again to hide herself. Kong Xiao laughed at her. Then he took out a box and pushed it in front of her. Wen Yuan looked at him. "Why did you give me a present for no reason?" "How can it be for no reason? I made up for your marriage." Kong Xiao smiled. "Open it." Wen Yuan looked at him and then opened it slowly. The thing inside was dazzling. Wen Yuan's eyes were a little warm and her heart was slightly aching. It was a piano made of crystal. How much time and effort did he spend to find such a thing? He couldn't have bought it at the last minute. He must have prepared it for a long time. Kong Xiao stared at her eyes and said slowly, "My mother said that you are the most talented student she has ever taught. She suggested you to study abroad, but you refused. I know you did it for Yi Mu Bai, but Wen Yuan, in my heart, you will always be the same Wen Yuan. You are not willing to be ordinary. You said that you want to perform on the best stage in the world. Have you forgotten?" "I haven't forgotten." Wen Yuan's eyes were wet. She was stunned for a long time before she looked up. "Kong Xiao, I just lost myself. Until now, I'm still lost." He understood her and still smiled. "It's okay. As long as you are happy, Wen Yuan. I mean, if one day you feel that you are not so happy, come back and play the piano. The way you play the piano." He rubbed his chin with his fingers. "It's pretty." Wen Yuan's eyes were filled with tears. She smiled. "I know." Kong Xiao was still the person who understood her after she had experienced so much. He was always by her side and always appeared warmly. Wen Yuan separated from him. She said that she would return to China after the baby was born and visit her teacher. She said that she would definitely be there when Kong Xiao got married. "Oh, I'll tell you when I find a girlfriend." He walked her to the parking lot. Along the way, the two of them chatted casually. He said that he didn't want to look for a mediocre person, and when Yuan said that Su Mo wasn't a mediocre person. She had seen him before. That moment was like returning to the past. It was especially beautiful. Kong Xiao walked her to the car and watched the car drive away. He stood where he was for a long time, then took out a cigarette and smoked. He seldom smoked, but at this moment his heart was bitter. The girl he had liked for more than 10 years was getting married and having a child. He was always disappointed. In the car, when Yuan gently caressed the box, feeling a bit complicated, Kong Xiao's words to her kept ringing in her ears. She also admitted that she gave up her dreams for a man, and she became not quite like herself. This kind of life, was it really what she wanted? This kind of man was not what she had imagined before. When Yuan suddenly realized that her life was actually a mess. Other than Yi Mu Bai, she actually had nothing. She raised her head, a teardrop at the corner of her eye. Su Mo was a little shocked when she saw this from the side. She said in a low voice, "Don't let the night guide see you like this, otherwise he might not be happy." End of chapter. Chapter 38-36. Promise me you'll never see him again. Wen Yuan looked up at Su Mo and smiled. Thank you. To her, Concho was a witness to her past dreams, which was wonderful. Su Mo could understand. She was very grateful. Su Mo shook her hand and smiled. Wen Yuan, can I call you Wen Yuan? Wen Yuan nodded. Su Mo said, in the past, I wanted to be a writer, but in the end, I only became a small assistant, and Ping Xiong's assistant at that. Wen Yuan was surprised. Su Mo coughed lightly. My ears are very sharp. Then, they looked at each other and smiled. Wen Yuan's sadness disappeared without a trace. When they arrived at the apartment, Su Mo left first. The housekeeper said that Xiangnan was taking an afternoon nap and asked if Wen Yuan had eaten. I ate outside, Wen Yuan said softly, and then she went back to her bedroom. She took out the box and carefully found a place to put it. She threw the box away because she was afraid that Yi Mubai would see it. She had been looking at it the whole afternoon. She suddenly felt a little happy in her heart, as if she had found a little bit of her past, and even felt a little free. Yi Mubai came home a little early. The auntie left during dinner. Yi Mubai didn't say anything at first. It wasn't until Xiangnan went to bed that he walked into the bedroom. Wen Yuan had finished showering and was wearing a bathrobe. His belly was bulging. She sits on the sofa and blow-dries her hair. Yi Mubai reaches for a towel and says, I'll help you dry it. It'll be dry after a while. It's not good to use too much of a pregnant hairdryer. Wen Yuan nodded and leaned back on the sofa, letting him take care of her. She didn't ask him what he did when he was out for a day, because she couldn't help and didn't like to meddle in a man's business. Yi Mubai, on the other hand, asked about her prenatal checkup and how the baby was. Wen Yuan leaned back comfortably with his eyes half closed. The child is fine. The ultrasound report is in the bag. Take a look at it yourself. He didn't say anything. He just dried her hair and carried her to the bed. Wen Yuan thought he was going to look at the prenatal checkup report, but he didn't leave for a long time. Wen Yuan opened his eyes. What's wrong? Yi Mubai's fingers gently stroke her face, and his voice is a little hoarse. Wen Yuan, am I not good enough to you? She shook her head, closed her eyes, and smiled. Why do you ask? He was very close to her, and the tip of his nose moved over to smell the fragrance of her body. After a while, his voice became even more hoarse. Do you like your current life? She opened her eyes and looked straight into his. His eyes were fixed on her, and he had no intention of moving away. Therefore, Wen Yuan knew that he had something to say to her, or he knew something. However, what she couldn't understand was that he had been very calm since he came back. She chuckled softly. You're quite patient. The tip of his nose gently touched hers. Wen Yuan, if I don't ask, you won't tell me, right? Say what? She didn't avoid his gaze and smiled lightly. Do you think there's anything else I need to say to you? Her smile was a little self-deprecating. Don't I even have the freedom to have a meal with a familiar friend? I remember we discussed this. He murmured, and his hand gently held her chin. Don't you remember? When Yuan's fingers clenched into a fist, and she said patiently, I didn't agree to anything. I also said that Kong Xiao is just a friend. There was nothing between me and him in the past, and there won't be anything between me and him in the future. Isn't that enough for Yi Mubai? Do you want me to avoid my mentor's son? End of this chapter. Chapter 38-37. I promise not to see him again. I promise not to see him again. He stared at her, not letting go of any changes in her expression. Wen Yuan, I mind. Wen Yuan looked at him for a long time before looking away. Are you following me? He didn't deny it. Su Mo will be fine if you don't see him. Wen Yuan was a little shocked. She turned to look at him, unable to believe what she had just heard. If she didn't see him, then what would happen to Su Mo? Under her gaze, Yi Mubai said calmly, Su Mo won't be able to find a job in the industry. Wen Yuan's annual salary is about 100,000 US dollars, and her family's annual expenses are about 600,000 to 700,000 US dollars. I forgot to tell you that she has a sick brother, and she needs to spend a lot of money. Wen Yuan looked at him with eyes that seemed to be quenched by ice. She had never thought that Yi Mubai was such a heartless man. She remembered that when she was infatuated with him, he was gentle to everyone. Even though he was heartless to her later on, he was still gentle to others. I don't believe it, she spat out. Yimubai smiled faintly. 1 yuan, you don't really understand men. In other words, men are male animals, and they are very protective of their territory. 1 yuan looked at him and said softly, is it because you don't have confidence, or because you don't think that you're good enough to make me fall head over heels for you? Yimubai, it's because you don't intend to give up everything, so you're using this method, right? If he had given his heart and given up everything, he wouldn't have needed to use this method to keep her. She could tell that he didn't want her to work or interact with other men. The only time she could go out was with him. It was as though she was going to be turned into an accessory by him. And yet, he seemed to be asking her to agree and be willing. She found it ridiculous. She looked at him as though he was a stranger and said softly, Yimubai, did you do this when you liked Lin Cece? Did you ask her to not see anyone else, not even Guze? She finally couldn't help but say what was in her heart. Or is it because you lost to Guze that you have a shadow in your heart that you would use such a method to lock up a woman? Yimubai's expression turned ugly. He stared at her for a long time without saying anything. 1 yuan laughed self-deprecatingly. I overestimated myself. She thought too much. She thought those desires were true love. His liking was just liking, and it was far from love. From the past till now, he had only loved Lin Cece. But now, 1 yuan realized to his horror that Lin Cece was the only one he loved. Yimubai stood up and said faintly, 1 yuan, you're thinking too much. No husband would want his wife to meet someone else in private and have an affair with someone else. 1 yuan stared at him for a long time before he walked to the door. She stopped him. Yimubai. He paused at the door. Have you thought it through? 1 yuan looked at his back and lowered her eyes. Her long eyelashes couldn't stop trembling. She couldn't even control her fingers, which were also trembling. She said softly with a hint of disillusionment in her eyes, I promise you that I won't see Kong Xiao in the future. Don't make things difficult for Suamo. She gently got out of bed and took out the SIM card. She walked into the bathroom and flushed the toilet. She took out the beautiful crystal piano and held it in front of him. Yimubai looked at her. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:38. Promise me that you won't see him again. 1 yuan was standing in front of him under the light. He had black hair and white clothes. She looked up at him, and the corner of her beautiful mouth moved slightly. Then she smiled, and there was a tear at the corner of her eye. She said, Yimubai, you weren't like this before. He was still staring at her. She was still smiling faintly, but her smile was uglier than crying. She looked like a very sad child. She didn't even wipe the tears that fell from the corner of her eyes. She just stared at him. Is it because you don't care about me that I don't have to worry about my dreams and feelings? Do I have to obey everything you say? Yimubai, tell me, is that right? He looked at her quietly. If you don't see him, we will be fine. Then what if I ask you not to see Lin Cece? 1 yuan's mouth trembled. Will you be willing? Yimubai didn't answer her. He was still angry with her. Did she have to fight with him like this for Kong Xiao? 1 yuan's tears fell down one by one. She didn't wipe them away, but let them fall one by one. I can never be in your heart like she is, right? Yimubai frowned. 1 yuan, you think too much. It's not that I think too much. Her voice became a little sharp. You have always treated me like this. Yimubai, even if you have a trace of patience, you would not use this way to deal with the matter between me and Kong Xiao. I didn't cheat on you. You had someone follow me, and all I did was have a meal. Suemo knew about it from the beginning. You told me not to contact you. I'm 1 yuan, not a cat or dog. She scratched her head. This is not the kind of life I want. Yimubai stared at her and said in a cold voice, What kind of life do you want? Let you be free to run around the world, surrounded by your admirers? He took a step forward. You're Xiangnan's mother, and we'll have another child in the future. 1 yuan, I'm very busy. I have to take care of you and Xiangnan. I don't have much time and energy to invest in relationships. So, I might hurt your self-esteem by doing this, but it's good for both of us. 1 yuan was stunned for a long time. She slowly looked up at him. Do you think I'll find someone else when I'm lonely? He didn't say anything. Wen Yuan stared at her, waiting for her answer. So she knew that their past, her marriage with Yi Mulin, wasn't something he didn't care about. There were some things he just didn't ask. In his heart, she was not clean. Marrying her and having children was just making do. Maybe he liked her a little bit, but he hoped for more. At this moment, Wen Yuan understood. Yi Bai was still Yi Bai, but he was different from before. He was Yi Bai in the Vanity Fair. He was no longer the Prince Charming who was willing to coax Lin Cece. Wen Yuan didn't quarrel or make a fuss. She just held the crystal piano. Yi Bai also looked at it. He knew that it was a gift from Kong Xiao. She treated it like a treasure since she came back. What he cared about was not the present, but the past. With such a man around, if there was any trouble between him and Wen Yuan, that man might take over his position. He didn't want any scandals in their marriage. Yi Bai wanted to say something, but Wen Yuan's hand loosened. The expensive gift in her hand slipped from her fingers and shattered on the ground. End of this chapter. Chapter 38-39. When the fragments fell to the ground, they reflected light and stung her eyes. Her eyes were quickly stained with tears, and she said very softly, "I know." Yi Bai was also stunned for a moment. He didn't want her to meet Kong Xiao, but it didn't mean that he would break things. Now that she had broken them, he didn't know what to say. Wen Yuan said softly, "I'll clean them up tomorrow. I want to sleep for a while now." After she finished speaking, she quietly walked to the bed and lay down. Yi Bai looked at her and frowned. "Wen Yuan, let's talk." She didn't say anything, but just lay there quietly, crying quietly. Yi Bai walked over and half knelt beside her. "Don't cry." She turned her face away. "I don't want to see you." The same person had disillusioned her twice. How naive was she to think that after they got married and he doted on her for a few days, she thought that she was the white moon in his heart. She, Wen Yuan, was just an old maid who warmed his bed. Kong Xiao was right. She had lost herself. She had been chasing after a man. She had forgotten that her name was Wen Yuan, and she had forgotten her dreams. She now thought that if she hadn't clung to him so awkwardly, he wouldn't have treated her like such a jerk. Wen Yuan buried her face in the pillow and cried silently. She hadn't been so fragile before. Maybe she had been spoiled by someone for a few days and became unreasonable. Yi Bai's heart was a little painful. He regretted it a little, but he didn't take back his words, because he really didn't want her to see Kong Xiao. That man was too much of a threat to him. He didn't know why, he just didn't want her to see him. However, countless times later, Yi Bai regretted that he didn't coax her that night. He didn't untie the knot in her heart. He just watched her sleep, and he just cleaned up the fragments. He slept in the guest room. At dawn, he received a call from Guze. He said that Lin Cece was in a car accident and only Qin Shun could perform the surgery. Qin Shun was in a meeting in New York and could not be contacted at the moment. Yi Bai answered the phone and immediately put on his clothes. Before he went out, he went back to the master bedroom, half knelt in front of her and kissed her face. "Wen Yuan, I have to go out for a while. It may take 2 or 3 days. Annie will be here soon. Let's talk about what happened before when we come back, okay?" Her face was a little pale. He thought she didn't sleep well, so he reached out and touched her face. "If you're tired, sleep for a while. I'll let Xiangnan dress himself." Wen Yuan opened his eyes. "Where are you going?" He was stunned. He shouldn't have told the truth, but he didn't want to lie to her. He said in a hoarse voice, "Cece got into a car accident. Qin Shun is in New York. I'll send Qin Shun back to B-City. I'll be back soon." Wen Yuan opened his eyes and looked at him. "I'm not feeling well. Be good, be good." He kissed her. "I'm only going for 2 or 3 days. I'm sorry about last night." Wen Yuan blinked a little sadly. "Are you sorry because of Lin Cece? You want to rush to her side, don't you?" Yi Bai frowned. "Wen Yuan, don't think like that." He was always in a hurry to find Qin Shun, so he didn't care too much about her. When he got up, Wen Yuan grabbed his sleeve again. "Bai, I'm really not feeling well. I want to go to the hospital." His expression was vaguely impatient, but he still tried to comfort her. "Wait for me to come back. I'll accompany you, for a prenatal checkup, okay? Please remember the domain name of this book.com. Wonderful Book House. Chapter 3840. When Yuan clasped his hand tightly, looking a little lost. You don't believe me? He paused for a moment. When Yuan, it's not the time to be willful. Cece needs me to find Qin Shun. When Yuan's face flashed with a touch of disappointment. She murmured, I need you too. Yi Mubai leaned over and kissed her forehead. Be good, I'll be back soon. He still broke free from her, walked out, and disappeared in front of her. He chose not to believe her and chose to go to another girl. The door outside closed with a soft sound. He left. When Yuan turned sideways and her whole body was stiff, she blinked gently and then smiled bitterly. She propped herself up and picked up the phone on the bedside table. She wanted to call Su Mo, but when she picked up the phone, a pool of blood slowly flowed out from under her white bathrobe, and her vision was slowly dyed red. Her fingers trembled, and she used the last bit of her strength to call Yimu Bai. She wanted him to come back. She wanted to tell him that the child might be gone. At this moment, she was very afraid. She was afraid that the child would be gone, and she was afraid that Xiangnan would be gone. If it was really gone, she would really have nothing left. The phone rang again and again. She listened to it absent-mindedly. Then he didn't answer the phone and hung up. The phone slipped from Wen Yuan's hand. Her hand touched the bathrobe, and it was full of blood. The child was fine yesterday, but now was it going to be gone? She made a hoarse voice. She wanted to call Xiangnan, but she was afraid of scaring Xiangnan. Fortunately, the aunt came. Probably because she smelled the blood, the aunt slowly came over and then screamed, "Oh my God! How could this happen?" She ran over, and Wen Yuan grabbed her hand. Before she lost consciousness, she whispered, "You must save this child." The aunt was about to cry. "Don't talk. Save your strength," the aunt called Mr. Yi. But he didn't answer, so she could only call Su Mo. Su Mo directly arranged a car to send Wen Yuan to the hospital. Later, he also kept calling Yimu Bai, but no one answered, and then his phone was turned off. For a day and a night, he couldn't contact Yimu Bai because his phone was out of battery and he couldn't turn it on the plane. When he found out that Wen Yuan had a miscarriage, he was in B City. When he heard Su Mo's hoarse voice say that there was only a 20% chance, Yimu Bai stood at the airport of B City, his whole body covered in ice. He remembered that when he left home yesterday, when Yuan held his hand and told him that she wasn't feeling well and that she needed to go to the hospital. However, he was worried about Lin Cece's condition, so he left her and chose to look for Qinshen. He didn't even dare to imagine what Wen Yuan was thinking or feeling when he left. Previously, because of Kong Qiao and the others' quarrel, he thought it was just a quarrel between husband and wife. After the quarrel, they would reconcile, just like the last time. However, he did not expect that she would be so uncomfortable that she would have a miscarriage. Yimu Bai immediately took a special plane back to New York. When he arrived at the hospital, it was already 38 hours later, but Wen Yuan had not woken up yet, and the child in her belly was not out of danger. Yimu Bai looked at the plain white wall and quickened his pace. Su Mo was guarding at the door. When he saw him coming, his eyes were red. "She's not awake yet." Yimu Bai asked in a trembling voice, "Where's the child?" He had a feeling that if the child was gone, he and Wen Yuan would be finished. Please remember the domain name of this book.com. Miao Shu Wu. Chapter 3841. Hearing his question, Su Mo replied in a hoarse voice, "The doctor is still trying his best." She paused for a moment. The doctor suggested to give up, but Wen Yuan must keep the child alive before she falls into a coma. Yimu Bai closed his eyes, and there was a pained frown on his face. He pushed the door open and saw Wen Yuan lying quietly on the white hospital bed. Her face was as pale as a piece of paper, without a single trace of blood. She didn't look like a pregnant woman at all. Sumo's voice was very soft. "She's been in a coma and hasn't woken up." Xiangnan came over and cried very sadly. "Auntie is taking care of her at home." She said a few words casually, but Yimu Bai could imagine Wen Yuan's situation at that time. He clenched his fists and sat down. His voice was a little low. You go out first. Suemo wanted to say something, but she swallowed her words and went out quietly. Yi Mubai looked at Wen Yuan. Her limbs were slender, and her lower abdomen was slightly bulging. There was an IV drip on her wrist, and the machine on the other side was beeping. She was so quiet, as if she was asleep, but also as if she would never wake up. He held her hand, and it was cold. His voice was hoarse. Wen Yuan, I'm sorry. It's my fault. I shouldn't have left you. I shouldn't have treated you like this. He lowered his head, and his face was pressed against the back of her hand. Kong Qiao stood at the door, and there was a hint of depression on his handsome face. Is there any use in saying sorry now? Kong Qiao didn't come in, and he just said lightly, if you loved her, you wouldn't have let her fall into such a desperate situation while she was pregnant with your child. If Annie hadn't come in time, you might not have been able to see her. Yi Mubai turned his head and looked at the man he used to mind very much. He had always liked Wen Yuan, and they could be considered childhood sweethearts. Kong Qiao lowered his eyes, and his gaze landed on Wen Yuan. He said softly, if I had known that I would hurt her, I would rather not have met her again. I would rather she foolishly chase after her dreams for the rest of her life, foolishly love someone who doesn't love her. Kong Qiao paused for a moment before he continued. Wen Yuan was never a naive and innocent person. She was just madly in love with someone. She once told me that the person she loved was worth it. She only planned to be crazy once in her life, and she only loved one person. She said that person's name was Yi Mubai, and he was the most handsome man in the world. Yi Mubai was also the most gentle man in the world. He loved animals very much, and he was extremely gentle to children. When she said those words, her eyes were glowing, as though there were many little stars in them. At that time, I wanted to cry because I would never have another chance because she loved you so much. As Kong Qiao said that, he lifted up Yi Mubai's collar. Right now, you're the most gentle man in the world, the most loving man in the world. You abandoned her and let her face all this pain and danger alone. Are you still a man? If you have other women in your heart, then don't marry her. What's wrong with Wen Yuan? She loves you, but that's not a reason for you to hurt her. If you don't love her, then let her go. Why did you suspect her? All the women in the world would cheat and betray Wen Yuan, but she wouldn't. As he said that, Kong Qiao's voice was a little choked. She gave up her dreams, she didn't study abroad, and it was all because of you, you bastard. But in your heart, she's cunning. She seduces men. She's useless. She's mediocre. Do you know why? It's because you said on the show that you like gentle women and that you like girls to be taken care of at home. Is this how you take care of her now that she's a mother? Chapter 3842. Kong Qiao still couldn't bear it and punched him. Yi Mubai didn't move away. At this moment, his heart was numb. He had heard so much from Kong Qiao. These were all things that Wen Yuan had never told him. At that time, Wen Yuan had collected information about him in such a state of mind. She said that he was gentle, that he was a caring man, and that he was very warm, but he treated her so cruelly. In Yi Mubai's heart, there was an indescribable feeling, and he forgot the pain. In a daze, he heard Kong Qiao say, "You are not qualified to have her, and you are not qualified to have her love." Kong Qiao didn't stay in hospital all the time. As he said, Wen Yuan was Yi Mubai's wife, and she was pregnant with Yi Mubai's child. She had to make all the decisions by herself. No matter how distressed he was, he could only protect her silently. He was afraid that when she woke up, she would still be stubborn and still love Yi Mubai, so he chose to give in. This was Kong Qiao's love for Wen Yuan. It had been like this for so many years. After Kong Qiao left, Suemo stood at the door and asked softly, "Director Yi, do you want to call a doctor to help you?" Yi Mubai leaned against the wall, lowered his eyes, and said very lightly, "No need." Suemo stood there, wanting to say something but hesitating. Yi Mubai turned his head and looked at her. "What's wrong?" Suemo bit her lip. "There is nothing between Wen Yuan and Mr. Kong. They are very normal friends." However, after this incident, She didn't know whether Wen Yuan would leave her boss and become an abnormal friend with Kong Qiao. Yi Mubai wiped his face and didn't say anything. He just said, "Call the doctor." Suemo nodded and called the doctor. Yi Mubai knew the doctor, so he gave him some information. If Mrs. Yi doesn't wake up, the child in her belly can't be kept any longer. It's very dangerous for both the adult and the child. Yi Mubai looked at him with red eyes, and his voice was very hoarse. "How long will it be if she doesn't wake up?" 3 days. The doctor gave him a definite answer. If she doesn't wake up after 3 days, it's recommended to abort the child. Although it's a pity, it has to be done this way. In fact, it's not suitable for this child to be in this state. Yi Mubai stared at Wen Yuan's face for a long time before asking in a low voice, "Is it because she doesn't have a strong desire to live now?" The doctor was stunned for a moment before he whispered, "You could say that." Yi Mubai closed his eyes slightly. After a long time, he whispered, "I understand." The doctor sighed and left. At the door, he suddenly turned around. "By the way, Mrs. Yi said that she wanted to keep the baby, and she kept calling Mr. Ye's name." Yi Mubai covered his face. His eyes were red and painful. After a long time, he whispered, "Thank you." The doctor wanted to say something comforting, but he couldn't. He knew what this child meant to the couple. It meant hope. After the doctor left, Yi Mubai slowly walked to Wen Yuan's side and sat down. He stayed with her, taking care of her and talking to her. But she didn't wake up. It was like she didn't want to come to the light in the dark. He knew that she didn't want to wake up because she was hurt by him. She begged him not to leave, but he refused. Yi Mubai closed his eyes. His eyes were hot, and his voice was extremely hoarse. "Wen Yuan, as long as you wake up, I'll treat you well. I won't leave you easily again." Perhaps, when he was about to lose her, he suddenly realized what he almost lost. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.